Thank you, Chris, Marty, Bob. I'm here representing the Life Sciences Consortium, also on behalf of Greg Kurt, who is also the chair. We have Ann Vickery and Charles Hugh Jones joining me today to talk about two very important topics. One is the generic oncology drug shortage, and the other is the issue of data sharing. We'll hopefully be able to leave enough time after each of those two presentations to have some question and answer with you, the audience. Let's orient ourselves to the Life Sciences Consortium. The idea is to create a collaborative model of companies working together to get innovative, improved cancer therapies to patients faster, something that I know all of you share along with me as a passion and a reason for our working in this field. The Life Science Consortium consists of 12 companies listed there that all work together to really accomplish things that none of us could accomplish individually. But it's not just these companies talking amongst themselves. It also is a venue for us to interact with third parties such as the Institute of Medicine, the National Cancer Institute, and the FDA. So it really brings in a relationship between the private sector, the not-for-profit sector, and the public sector that really can help us see problems from a much more comprehensive perspective than any of us could obtain ourselves. The life sciences mandate is to accomplish together what no single company might consider alone, to provide safe and effective medicines faster, and to be, as President Bush exhorted our leaders, to be bold and venturesome. So in the spirit of being collaborative and catalytic, the first part of the presentation will focus on the problem of generic drug shortage. And this slide, which came from Sandy Queter at the FDA, I think summarizes it very, very well. As you can see, in the blue are all the drug shortages over the last 6 or 7 years, and you can see that's a trend that's only gone upward. The red bar represents injectables, which represent the majority of the problem. Since 2009, 94% of cancer treatment facilities, 94%, virtually every cancer treatment center that you could think of, has experienced a drug shortage. And 84% have had to temporarily suspend or modify a treatment regimen. When we think about individuals whose lives might be improved or prolonged due to these treatments, that's unacceptable. But when you think about individuals who are receiving adjuvant therapy, that actually is going to be the difference whether some people recur or not recur, whether some people die from their disease or are cured from their disease. This becomes even more magnified. These cancer drug shortages are disruptive to the hospital or facility and increases the time required to procure those drugs. It's dangerous to patients because the medication errors can and do occur, and substitution of alternative presentations or medicines can lead to this confusion. It impairs the conduct of clinical cancer trials and delays the development of new cancer treatments. And Dr. Jim Doroshow, Deputy Director of the NCI, is going to be able to comment a bit, and he's here with us today. It's frustrating for physicians, and it's emotionally upsetting to patients and families. Now, initially, people looked for the root cause for this. What was the reason that we were experiencing these cancer drug shortages? And initially, efforts to focus on just a single underlying cause failed to recognize the complexity of this. And I think it's important to understand the scope of the problem so that any solutions are likely to have an impact. And this is my attempt to try and put this all in a single diagram. So starting from the upper left, we'll trace the drug through its lifespan. It could be lack of raw materials. That sometimes is the case, but even more often, it may be poor quality or impurity of raw materials. Considering many of the sources for these raw materials don't have oversight by regulatory agencies, this has really left the purview of the companies, some of which are more rigorous about sourcing and the quality of that sourcing. It could be due to manufacturing failure, and that also includes inadequate quality of the manufactured product. So impurities or a particulate matter that does not allow the drug to be released. It could be a decision by the manufacturer to reduce production for a variety of reasons. It could be purchasing practices of the General Purchasing Organizations, or GPOs, just a handful of which control the drug distribution to healthcare facilities around the country. It could be stockpiling, and many of you heard of the gray market, which have been reported to be associated with increases in pricing that are sometimes in the thousands of percent above the normal cost of the drug to the healthcare facility. It's the inability to meet unexpected market demand. It could be the protracted review time for ANDAs. And lastly, it could be a change in the standard of care. So I think that as you follow this around, you see it could occur at any one of a number of different places. But it's not even this simple, because when you look into this problem, the normal laws of supply and demand do not apply to generic cancer drugs. Manufacturers are unable to respond to short-term price increases as they have no redundancy and capacity. And there is a contradiction between the high treatment value placed on generic cancer drugs and the low prices the market is prepared to pay for them. And unfortunately, this ends up to being a race to the bottom, which benefits no one because it drives manufacturers out of the market. Fewer manufacturers for a mainstay cancer drug can cause a shortage when any remaining manufacturers experiences a supply interruption. And this has happened with cytarabine, paclitaxel, leucovorin, et cetera. And a financial incentive for oncologists to prescribe a brand over generic, thereby reducing volumes for a generic product, so less is produced, and disincentivizing manufacturers from continuing its production, and you end up having only levolucovorin available when leucovorin was previously available at only a fraction of the cost. Now, it was interesting at a meeting that was held at the NCI earlier this month. Again, Sandra Queter from the FDA showed this slide. And she made the point that 75% of all shortages are really due to manufacturing problems, either product quality or delays, capacity, or a loss of manufacturing sites. Only a fraction were due to discontinuations, raw materials, new demand. But if you recall the slide I showed a couple of slides ago, it really doesn't take into account some of the other reasons, such as potential stockpiling or impurities of raw materials or protracted FDA review times. And in fact, it really takes a considerable amount of effort and time, people, and money to file, prepare, and launch a generic product in the United States. Regulatory hurdles are steep and timelines are long. The average review time for an ANDA is between 2 and 2.5 years. So as you can imagine, this makes it very difficult for companies who have a drug that may be in short supply to have that drug reviewed expeditiously by the agency and either prevent or shorten the duration of the drug shortage. Cancer medicines, as you all know, are toxic and therefore need special preparation and handling. From a manufacturing perspective, significant capital outlays and investment in dedicated manufacturing capabilities are required to ensure the sterile environment that's needed and the containment for raw materials and product at every stage of production. And as much as oncology is our world, these are not the total universe for pharmaceuticals. In fact, it's actually a small proportion of the total drugs that are produced in this country each year. So as a result, in these manufacturing facilities, the duration of time that you are actually running the production line for a particular drug might be incredibly short. It might be a few weeks or even a few days to really produce the entire year's supply of that particular drug. And if at some point down the line a problem is identified with that drug that does not allow you to release that drug, these production lines are scheduled so far in advance, sometimes years in advance, that it becomes very difficult to fit in a repeat run for a drug that you didn't anticipate having to rerun. So that makes it very difficult for manufacturers to respond in a timely fashion, even though they recognize there is a market need for that. So what I've done in a very short period of time is to lay out the problems of a very complex area. And now I'd like to turn it over to Ann Vickery from Hogan Lovells to provide us with the solutions.
Well, I'm here, I'm just a lawyer, so I only compile information and pass it along to people who are in the business of actually fixing things and not just pointing out all the complex components of fixing things. But we can always count on, at Hogan Lovells, we love doing work for the CEO Roundtable because, like Christy, I think we are all a little bit masochistic in that we like these complicated problems that you have to chew on for a while and have to do a lot of thinking about. And this is certainly one of those. So I'm just going to start by telling you what there have been a number of pretty comprehensive studies of this problem done by your taxpayer dollars and mine. There was quite a good one done by the Assistant Secretary for Planning and Evaluation at HHS, known in the trade as ASPE. The FDA itself has done both study and been studied by the GAO. About how it is responding to this. And the things that have been identified, the things that are on my slide, are things that have been identified by other people that I've picked up and put on a list. So the FDA has said that one of the problems they had was that there, aside from one provision of law that requires that if you have a particularly important product and you're going to discontinue it under current law, you do have to report that to the FDA when you make a decision not to make it anymore. The rest of the things that the FDA has been doing recently have been done under an executive order, which is quite an unusual thing to happen, actually, in my quite lengthy experience in Washington. Executive orders aren't issued all that often, and usually they're on arcane things. The president actually suggested to the FDA that they use whatever authority they could find to intervene and also ask manufacturers voluntarily to start reporting things that they're not lawfully required to report. So that's one of the barriers at the moment to an effective response is the lack of appropriate authority to gather the information. And I'll tell you in a minute what they've done with that information. As usual, the FDA pleads lack of funding because there has been actually, as I'm sure many of you know, an increase in focus on safety issues after there were some problems with, I think, heparin from China or something like that. So they do feel they need more inspectors, particularly to inspect plants that are outside the U.S. They also have a huge backlog of ANDAs, as I think was previously mentioned by Mace, and the number of reviewers that they need to get rid of that backlog is a problem. So what are the challenges for the manufacturers? Several of these have already been mentioned. This is the drugs we are particularly talking about today, which is a subset of the drugs that are in shortage, tend to be the sterile injectable drugs used to treat cancer patients. There are other drugs used to treat cancer patients that are in other categories. We've tended to focus on the agents to treat cancer, not the pain drugs or the anesthesia drugs, which we know cancer patients also need. So the challenge has to do with how expensive it is to make these products, the sterile injectables, as compared to, say, pills. The FDA thinks that it's easy, we have this government versus private sector thing going here, which is a theme you will hear about. But from the government's perspective, the manufacturers who are having these problems are not adequately creating contingency plans or alternative capability in case the plant that, as May said, has already done its run and that batch couldn't be used. A difficult situation in the manufacturing space. There are regulatory and financial hurdles, of course. If you want to create a new facility, you have to get it approved by the FDA. And again, if they don't have enough inspectors, then it gets in a queue, and it may take a long time to get your plant up and running. And then there's the really serious problem of the free market economy that we live in, which has been driving down over time, after a patent expires on a product and more generic companies come into the marketplace, there is price competition. God forbid. It drives down the price. That is exacerbated. And the FDA and ASPE commented on this, that the way that these products are purchased by hospitals and other facilities using group purchasing organizations does appear to be a factor in that you might have a number of companies who make a generic product, but the one who gets the big contract with a group purchasing organization may be the one that stays in the market and the others drop out. These are all barriers that have been reported in the literature. So what are the other suggestions that have been made publicly to date about how to, in the short run, alleviate these problems? Most of the information on this slide is directly off of a slide that was used by Sandra Quitter at the FDA's Office of Drug Shortages at a presentation at NCI recently. And it is quite impressive, is that since last year, they have really stepped up, especially after the voluntary disclosure started, really getting them more information about drugs that were about to be in shortage. They have expedited reviews. They have pulled ANDAs out of the queue, that long queue, and said, whoops, we need yours, and have approved them very quickly. They have allowed new manufacturing applications where people need to change something or another to be dealt with faster than they would be if they were not for a shortage drug. They are trying to, in some cases, allow companies whose plants had a quality problem, which meant that they were in some way adulterating the vial of something, to come up with a temporary solution to be able to use that actual batch by putting filters in and or having special labeling that went out with the product, telling doctors how to use it safely with patients, because it was that important, which I think is an impressive flexibility for an agency that often gets maligned for not being very flexible. They are also using the bully pulpit by going out, if they see a real shortage of a really important cancer drug coming, they can go out and talk to companies who they know can make the product to see if they would like to come back into the market, or if they are already making the product, increase their production so that the supply gets better balanced. And then in probably the most surprising thing that was reported is that, I can't remember now exactly which of the drugs it was, Mace, you may remember, but the FDA actually allowed the importation of a drug from a foreign facility. The facility, I believe, had been inspected, but the drug the manufacturer had not submitted an application to the FDA. The FDA knew none of the intricate details that they usually know about a drug before they approve it. They allowed it to come in because of the shortage. So there's been quite a good deal of short term. Nobody thinks these are the ways that we will continue for many years to operate, however. So what are the longer term solutions? The early notification authority, it would be, the FDA would like for the early notification authority to be in the statute so that they wouldn't be dealing with a voluntary situation but could require it. So there are a number of bills that have been introduced. The administration has endorsed this concept. And as usual, we're now just starting the process of the details being spelled out in statutory language by the relevant committees. That has started. Just last week, there is a draft Energy and Commerce bill that was floated around. And let me give you a sense of how difficult this is going to be going forward once we get to this stage. We may have to turn Christy loose on this because she's got a good deal of experience with the Congress and moving things from concept to actual statutory language. So what the draft Energy and Commerce bill would say is as follows. A manufacturer of a drug that is life-supporting, life-sustaining, or intended for use in the prevention of a debilitating disease or condition for which an ANDA or an NDA has been approved, and who knows, one of you may have this, we can thank you for this, I guess, and it's not a product that was originally derived from human tissue and was replaced by a recombinant product. Shall notify the Secretary of a discontinuance of the manufacture of the drug or an interruption of the manufacture of the drug that is likely to produce a drug shortage. And if you're discontinuing the product, it would be a 6-month notification period. If there is something which is likely to result in a drug shortage, it would be as soon as possible after you know it. So that's sort of where we are with the first draft to surface. It will be interesting to see how that plays out as the Congress moves through this. It almost surely will be included, if there is language, which I think there will be included in the various user fee extensions, which are in the category of must do this year. And there is some overlap with that series of statutory proposals. So the FDA also thinks that the culture, and I'm quoting now, but that the culture of the manufacturers who have had these problems, according to the FDA at this meeting, is not the culture of quality that they would like to see. And the FDA is suggesting that there be a culture change among the manufacturers of products like these, and in particular that there be more attention to contingency planning and risk management. The funding that FDA is looking for will be to some extent provided by the user fees, because as many of you know, in addition to the user fees that have been in place for many years for the innovator companies, there will be user fees now for generic applications, and there will be therefore more money for reviewing those applications that will be available to the FDA. They can hire more people. Then there's the effort to control the hoarding and the price gouging, which is the sort of separate, I would say, legislative effort, because it probably goes in some other bill, because Senator Schumer, for example, has suggested that there be criminal penalties for price gouging of a shortage drug. Other people have pointed to the supply chain, which does go sort of to the hoarding issue. And this has been a topic that's been around forever in Washington, is tracking drugs once they leave the manufacturer. Where do they go? How can you keep them out of a secondary market that was not intended to exist, for example? There are also various proposals to create financial incentives, one or two of which I'll mention later. There's a suggestion that the reimbursement under Medicare be changed to create more wherewithal for the manufacturers. And then there's a proposal which I think is not getting serious consideration because it would be hard to implement when there is a shortage, and that is to create a stockpile of drugs. The United States government would buy the drugs and keep them for shortage periods, which may work if everything came back to normal for a while, but in the short term probably wouldn't. So what do we have that is actually in legislation or pending being in legislation that's either in draft form or has been introduced? As I mentioned to you, the definitions of what would have to be reported are in both bills that have been introduced and the draft that the committee staff are working on the House side. There is, I think, going to be an issue which will be hard to deal with probably, and that is the need of the public. For example, the hospitals and the physicians have reported, when they've been asked, that it's a huge problem because they don't know when the shortage of which drug is going to happen. So the pharmacists who are trying to keep the supplies as close to what they need as possible, are finding it very difficult to do that because the shortages seem to them to be unexpected. They don't know. So there are some of the legislation would create a database that would be updated frequently by the FDA that would say, okay, these are the drugs that we think are going to be in shortage. This creates a problem for the manufacturers who are now required to report because, there's some information that currently would not be something that you would have to report under the materiality standard, for example, of your SEC filings. And it may be that in the past you would not have felt it necessary to tell anybody that there's some possibility that there might be some shortage because you don't know for sure that it is. Creates some tension between the public's interest in knowing that your drug might come into shortage. Also, it creates the possibility that if people are told that your drug is going to come into a shortage situation, people would start hoarding it. So difficult issue. And then there's the authority of the FDA to do what it's currently doing. That the FDA wants more authority to actually work with manufacturers to do things which may not be consistent with what they've done all along. As I mentioned, the user fees will create some new funding. There is an interest, I think, among a number of the policymakers who are involved in this in creating the ability to prioritize certain use of the FDA's limited staff so that there would be people sent back in to inspect a plant that already had problems. That's probably required already. It maybe isn't happening as frequently as it should. And then the again, thing that they've been doing, which is to put at the front of the queue something that is for a shortage drug. This brings you back to the definition that I just read to you, which is, okay, so what is a shortage drug? First of all, it would have to meet this 3 or 4 part definition in the statute, however that turns out. And the FDA is given under this draft from Energy and Commerce about 18 months to say in regulations what that means. So that's sort of the universe of what these special things would then apply to. So what about incentives? The incentives that are in the Energy and Commerce draft, possibly because it's a part of the user fee legislation, would be that for these drugs, which would be on some list somewhere, where necessary to avoid a shortage, the user fee for that application could be waived or reduced. Not much money, but some money. And then what would happen on the stick side of the equation? One, as I mentioned, is civil monitor or making a crime to engage in pricing, which is defined however Chuck Schumer would define price gouging, but also a civil monetary penalty if you knew about a shortage being imminent of one of your products and you didn't report it. It would be, I'm sure, most of the civil monetary penalty provisions of the statute have a knowingly requirement, so you would have to know this information and deliberately decide not to report it. So with that, I hope I've confused you enough so that we'll have a good back and forth on this.
Before we get on to the Metapharm presentation by Charles Hugh Jones, I did want to invite Jim Darshow to speak for a minute or two about the perspective of the impact of the generic oncology drug shortage on the development of clinical trials and the execution of clinical trials.
So I'll just spend a second because I'm not going to tell you anything that you wouldn't already infer from Mace's presentation, and that is that when we do have surveyed our grantees, and the NCI supports about accrual of about 30,000 patients a year to cancer-related trials, the number that we get back is that roughly at any one point in time, about 40% of those trials have been adversely impacted by various types of generic shortages. The point is, however, that it's not just a static 40%, because as the drugs come and go in terms of their shortage, it's basically the entire portfolio, because it might be 40% today for these drugs and 40% tomorrow for another set of drugs. So basically the entire NCI portfolio of clinical trials, which almost always use a generic injectable as either the control arm or part of an experimental arm with other agents, has been quite significantly impacted. And our accrual for last year was clearly decreased, I think at least in part related to the lack of availability of drugs.
Thank you very much. So I think we'll need to go on now.
Has there been any talk of a government-owned and operated facility?
Could you repeat the question?
Has there been any talk of a government-owned and operated facility?
Actually, I think there was at this meeting. Mason and I were both there. There was some talk about that, Jim. I don't know if it was while you were still there or not, but I think that there has been some thought given to that. Whether it's a viable possibility, I don't know.
Right, I agree.
Before we close off on the last panel, was there any further comment on the issue of either data sharing or of the drug shortages? Yes, Debashish?
Charles, we started off with this idea of sort of spurring data sharing as a concept, and I think we've come a long way thanks to your leadership and LSC sponsorship on this. My suggestion would be to think about the data beyond just the usual clinical trial data to also the biomarker data, which will be a difficult beast to tackle, and I think is the path forward if we really want to bend that curve. And the second piece is, I also think we have to be careful that we don't try to push data just for the sake of sharing data, but really sort of see what the end result of that data sharing is. I mean, what Rich suggested and what was done by Dan and that group is just an incredible use of the data set. So I think we have to also think carefully about what the use can be, what the potential use can be, and is it actually getting used in that manner?
Yeah. No, I mean, Debashish, I completely agree with you on that. Going back to the first question with regards to biomarkers, absolutely. I think the other thing that would be interesting to include with time is cost data as well. As we're getting to the cost-benefit curve of oncology drugs is going up and up and up, I think it's the sort of information that's going to be valuable for people to use. Your second point I agree with entirely as well. I think part of what the program has been so far is the how we do it, with a certain amount of what it's going to be. I think the real question now, and it's going to be great to get some input, not only from corporate sponsors, but also from the academic sector, is to how we do it. What we do, now that we've worked out how we do it, the question is, what does it look like? And I think for the next 6 to 9 months, it's something we're going to be sharing across the Life Sciences Consortium to make sure we get that right. And I think, Derek, your point about different ways of doing it, it would be really valuable to get that sort of input as well as federal input as well.
All right. Well, let me first thank the panel. I think
Thank you for
Mace, I appreciate your leadership as co-chair, and I think both you and Ann have tackled an extremely important, very difficult topic with the drug shortages. We already have evidence that some people are not getting the cancer treatment that they need, and so trying to find a solution, but as we've seen, that there is no one cause, and it's not going to be an easy fix. And Charles, I thank you. I greatly believe that it's only through greater collaboration, and that includes data sharing, that we're going to accelerate research and finding new cures. I think the interesting thing is how complicated this really is, and so I appreciate you and your team sticking through this to be the guinea pig in this process to see, what can we come up with in terms of solutions to some of these problems. And hopefully, if we can do that, my view is that other member companies are equally interested in the concept of sharing and getting research to move forward. But even with the best intention, people run into the internal hurdles because of intellectual property, because of HIPAA and the like. So until I think we solve those, we won't be able to move forward. But it sounds like we've made huge progress, and so I thank you and the team for that. So thanks very much to the panel.